On the island of Proconnesus, a magician visits a small shop. Inside, he drops dead. The storekeeper hastily closes the shop and runs to tell the man's family. The news quickly spread across town, and on the road, the shopkeeper ran into a traveler coming in from the neighboring Cyzicus. The traveler was confused by the panic, as he claimed to have just seen that magician on the road, very much alive. Upon returning to the shop, they found the body had mysteriously vanished. 7 years later, the magician returns to Proconnesus as if no time had passed. He came bearing great tales of a fantastic journey to the furthest edges of the world, which he compiled in a poem called the Aristotle. It spoke of magical men who flew with spirits and shapeshifted into birds, of mythical beasts like griffins, and a race of one-eyed men guarding troves of gold. All this he witnessed in the furthest reaches of the north, accompanied by Apollo. Then, without explanation, he disappears again. This is the legend of Aristeas of Proconnesus, the semi-mythical philosopher and miracle worker of the 7th century BC, whose story was preserved by the father of history himself, Herodotus. And this isn't even the strangest part of the story, as it's not the last time we'll see him. For over a century, scholars have wondered whether Aristeas was simply telling a fantastic tale or preserving traces of ecstatic traditions reaching far beyond Greece. This exploration will ask if Aristeas was a kind of shaman. During this time in Greek history, it was the pre-Socratic philosophers, that is, before Socrates, who were the most influential in laying the foundations of the West, what would eventually be the modern world. Now, the West usually takes pride in its triumph of rationality, but these early Greek mystics and shamans were the furthest thing from that ideal. The distinction between magic, science, poetry, and philosophy did not exist. To understand how this might have unfolded, we first need to visit the world into which Aristeas claimed to have journeyed. Before we continue, if you also find yourself at this intersection between ancient history, philosophy, consciousness studies, religion, and probably like 10 other things, you should definitely subscribe, hit the bell, and stick around. These videos come from the soul, and I've got so much planned for this channel. Anyway, back to the story. Aristeas claimed to have traveled to the northern edge of the known world, so before we follow him any further, we need to understand who actually lived there. Ancient Greece didn't develop in isolation, after all. Beginning in the 8th and 7th centuries BC, Greek settlers established colonies along much of the Black Sea coast. These flourishing ports became hubs of trade and cultural exchange, where goods, travelers, stories, and ideas flowed between the Greek world and the peoples beyond it. And beyond those colonies stretched the territory of a vast nomadic culture that left behind no written history of its own. These territories were home to a people known as the Scythians, a diverse collection of Iranian-speaking nomads whose ancestors migrated westward from the Eurasian steppes of Central Asia over the preceding centuries. They occupied the Pontic-Caspian steppe, the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea. Rather than building permanent settlements, they lived in wagons and portable felt tents, similar to the yurts of later Turkic peoples, while leading a mobile pastoral life with their herds. It was in these Greek colonies along the northern shores of the Black Sea that the Scythians traded, intermarried, and came into regular contact with Greek merchants, explorers, and travelers. As a result, virtually everything we know about the Scythians comes through the writings of those Greek observers. And among those Greek witnesses, Herodotus is by far our most important source. His account offers the clearest glimpse into the customs, beliefs, and rituals of the Scythians, and it is also through Herodotus that we encounter Aristeas once again. As we will soon see, Aristeas is only the first in a compelling series of semi-mythical figures who operated at the crossroads between philosophy, magic, and myth. Our most detailed glimpse into the world of the Scythians and neighboring tribes comes from Herodotus. Widely regarded as the so-called father of history, in the 5th century BC he wrote the Histories, and it is within Book 4 that he really lingers on them. He describes their burial mounds, richly furnished tombs for Scythian kings, and rituals of procession and mourning that suggest the importance they placed on death and the afterlife. He also describes their practice inside a tented vapor bath, where large quantities of hemp were thrown onto hot stones, filling the space with intoxicating vapors. This ritual would always follow the funerary procession and burial, and according to Herodotus, inside the tents the Scythians could be heard wildly howling like wolves. One of the first scholars to systematically investigate these practices was the Swiss ethnologist Carl Muley. In a landmark 1935 paper titled Scythica, Muley argued that the Scythian sweat lodge was in fact a ritual intended to induce ecstatic states. Drawing on comparative ethnology, he compared these rites to the sweat lodges of the indigenous peoples of North America, where sweat baths were often combined with fasting, various plant medicines, and other techniques for altering consciousness. Muley concluded that these practices were, quote, one of the most important forms of ritual purification, and a chief means of attaining supernaturally heightened, ecstatic states. If Muley's interpretation is correct, then the Greeks were not simply trading with nomadic horsemen. They were encountering cultures in which altered states of consciousness and archaic techniques of ecstasy likely formed an integral part of their religious life. To state it more bluntly, it would appear that the grandfathers of rationality in the Western philosophical tradition had met face to face with a culture remembered as howling in ecstasy. Through fasting, purification, intoxicants, and other ecstatic techniques, this Scythian rite appears remarkably similar to what later scholars would identify with shamanism. Herodotus was writing as a curious outsider, trying to make sense of practices that didn't fit his own categories. His account tells us that there was a frontier where sustained cultural contact was possible, a frontier where ecstatic rites were already being practiced. And now that we've briefly surveyed what lay beyond the boundaries of ancient Greece around this time, we can return to the legend of Aristeas in light of this understanding. According to the legend, Aristeas reappeared in Proconnesus 7 years after his supposed death in the fuller's shop and composed a poem recounting his travels. That poem, the Aristotle, has unfortunately been lost. Herodotus probably had access to the now lost Aristotle, and through his account we can partially reconstruct the strange geography of Aristeas' journey. He tells us that Aristeas traveled while possessed by Phoebus, Apollo, and reached an ancient people known as the Ecstatic. Beyond them lived the one-eyed Aristopians. Beyond the Aristopians were the gold-guarding griffins. And finally, at the furthest edge of the world were the Hyperboreans. But the legend of Aristeas doesn't end here. Herodotus recounts an event said to have occurred at Metapontum in southern Italy, 240 years after Aristeas' second disappearance. According to the Metapontines, the ghost of Aristeas appeared before them and commanded them to establish an altar to Apollo, with a statue bearing the name Aristeas of Marmora beside it. He explained that Apollo had previously visited their city, and that he himself had accompanied the god in the form of a raven. Having delivered this message, he vanished once again. The Metapontines went to the Oracle of Delphi to inquire about the meaning of this apparition. In a state of prophetic madness, the oracle told them to heed Aristeas' instructions. They built the altar and statue in the market square of the town and inscribed it with Aristeas' name. Herodotus tells us that even in his own lifetime, the statue of Aristeas still stood there beside the image of Apollo, surrounded by myrtle bushes. There is good reason to believe that Aristeas was a kind of Greek shaman. Personally, I wonder whether the lost poem may have contained stories about him learning much of these archaic techniques of ecstasy. Perhaps there was already in place a kind of mystical shamanic cult in Scythia or neighboring regions, which greatly inspired Aristeas and influenced the legends around him. After all, there is a vast literature that documents in incredible detail the shamanic cultures in these remote Eurasian territories. As for the Aristotle, however, we will probably never know what it really said. The first scholars to rigorously put forward the case for Greek shamanism were Carl Muley, who we quoted earlier, and E.R. Dodds, who later expanded the argument in his influential book, The Greeks and the Irrational. The argument rests on the unusual cluster of traditions surrounding him: divine possession, disappearance, bilocation and return, an association with Apollo and Hyperborea, transformation into a bird, and, according to later writers, the ability of his soul to leave his body. It's probably worth being clear on what we mean by shaman, as the term can be used pretty loosely at times. In the history of religions, it usually refers to a religious specialist who deliberately enters ecstatic states in order to heal, prophesy, communicate with spirits, or journey beyond the ordinary world. The term originally belongs to northern Eurasian traditions. Not every culture had shamans, nor were all shamans identical, but the term is used to identify a recurring pattern of ecstatic practices and beliefs. Shamanism is the original religion. Animism is the original worldview. Everything is alive and filled with animated spirits and souls. Both of these go hand in hand, go far enough back in time, and the most primordial roots of every culture begin with shamanism in some form. Centuries after Herodotus, later writers made the ecstatic nature of Aristeas' journey much more explicit. Maximus of Tyre, a sophist of the 2nd century AD, greatly admired Aristeas for his ability of soul flight. Quote, he used to say that his soul, leaving his body and flying straight up to the bright sky, made a circuit of both Greek and foreign lands, along with all their islands and rivers and mountains. The far point in his soul's excursion was the land of the Hyperboreans. Pliny the Elder preserves an even stranger version. He writes that the soul of Aristeas was seen flying from his mouth in the shape of a raven, although Pliny himself immediately dismisses the surrounding tradition as fabulous. The much later Suda, a Byzantine text of the 10th century, likewise mentions how Aristeas, anytime he wished, could send his soul out of his body and return again. That the soul of Aristeas took the form of a raven is especially significant. In northern Siberia and America, the raven is often regarded as the prototype or ancestor of shamans. Religious historian Mircea Eliade documented the belief of birds being the receptacle of both the souls of the dead and the entranced shaman. Birds in general have an important significance in these traditions, appearing as helpful spirits, symbols of magical flight, and symbolizing the ability to move between the human and spiritual worlds. Eliade further noted how among the Laps, Yakut, Tungus, and several others, a secret language of nature was understood by the shaman during ecstatic trance. Quote, learning the language of animals, especially birds, is equivalent to knowing the secrets of nature, and hence being able to prophesy. The ancient Greek playwright and tragedian Aeschylus, in his Prometheus Bound, refers to both the Aristopians and Griffins, which suggests that he too likely had read Aristeas' lost poem. In some of his other plays, Aeschylus also uses the word Iatromantis. This Greek word's literal translation is Physician-Seer, and Aeschylus uses it to refer to both Apollo Let's remember Aristeas' connection to Apollo in light of this, and Asclepius, the god of medicine and son of Apollo. Now, just in this word alone, Iatromantis and Iatros, physician, is a very deep rabbit hole. It even has connections to Jesus, but that's a story for another day. Scholar Peter Kingsley connects the Iatromantis to this wider Greek and Asian shamanic tradition. Kingsley likewise suggested that one of the primary ecstatic practices of the Iatromantis was related to the temples of Asclepius, where the highly sophisticated practices of dream incubation were held. It is here that the parallels with northern Eurasian shamanism become harder to ignore. Ecstatic soul flight occupies a central place in Eliad's model of the shaman, and later Greek and Roman writers remembered Aristeas as someone whose soul could detach itself from the body, travel across vast distances, and return. The experienced shaman is the one whose soul journeys into the underworld and the heavens, and returns to his body with supernatural knowledge. And for Aristeas, the combination of Apollo, divine possession, disappearance, bird transformation, Hyperborean travel, and disembodied flight is exactly why Muley and Dodds saw him as a shaman. And Aristeas was not alone. Across the archaic and early classical periods, Greek tradition preserved the memories of other wandering sages, prophets, healers, and miracle workers, whose powers bear the distinct signatures of a shamanic nature. And spoiler alert, these magicians lead directly to the monumental figures who conceived of the most basic foundations of the West, logic and rationality, figures like Parmenides and Plato. From the late archaic into the early classical period, Greek tradition preserves the memories of a series of remarkable magicians, seers, healers, and religious teachers. Scholars like Muley and Dodds have interpreted this as evidence of contact with northern shamanic cultures. A few of these figures are directly linked to the far north, and most of them exhibit the traits we've already explored: prolonged solitude and fasting, magical flight, prophecy, purification, and the ability of the soul to leave the body. Out of the north came Abaris, carrying the sacred arrow of Apollo. He was sent from the land of Hyperborea, the distant wonderland where Apollo retreated to each winter. He was said to be so advanced in the art of fasting so as to have dispensed with the need for food entirely. His legend developed over the centuries, but since the earliest times, he was seen as a magical authority. Herodotus speaks of his ascetic qualities, that he traveled the world without once eating. Later writers, such as Heraclides Ponticus, transformed Apollo's arrow into an instrument of supernatural flight. Abaris was said to have flown on the arrow from Hyperborea. Iamblichus says Abaris used his magical techniques to banish plagues and pestilences, predict earthquakes, and prophesy future events. He passed from land to land, teaching the worship of his northern god, who the Greeks called the Hyperborean Apollo. Whether or not Abaris literally flew on an arrow is beside the point. The key thing to notice here is the shamanic motif of magical flight. I think we could even draw parallels here to the idea of the witch flying on her broomstick, something we looked at in a previous video. And just like the shaman, Abaris used his magic to interact with the natural world for the betterment of the collective. Just like Aristeas too, he is connected with Apollo, who many scholars consider the most shamanistic god out of the whole Greek pantheon. Another legendary figure who reportedly had the ability to leave his body and traverse vast distances was Hermotimus of Clazomenae. While his body lay inanimate at home, his soul went on ecstatic voyages, often returning with esoteric lore and knowledge of the future. Whether he really existed isn't known for sure, But Aristotle does actually credit Hermotimus with expressing the idea of a divine intellect, a kind of mind in nature, responsible for the cause of order and arrangement of the cosmos. This is the idea that would come to be known as nous. Aristotle says Hermotimus anticipated it, but it wasn't until Anaxagoras that the term would become a central cosmic principle. Hermotimus was also believed to have been one of the previous incarnations of Pythagoras, and appears alongside 3 others in a kind of genealogy of his past lives, according to Heraclides Ponticus. And lastly, ancient sources like Pliny's Natural History and Apollonius Mirabilia tell us the grim fate of this magical philosopher. As his soul was journeying far away, his enemies set fire to his defenseless body. His soul was unable to find its vessel, and Hermotimus was never seen again. The people of Clazomenae reportedly built a temple or shrine in his honor. Epimenides is yet another semi-mythical sage with many shamanic qualities. According to Diogenes Laertius, one fateful day he was sent out to the countryside by his father to look for a lost sheep. After much searching to no avail, he stumbled upon a cave and went inside to rest. Legend has it that Epimenides fell asleep in this sacred cave for 57 years, and awoke with the gift of prophecy and divine powers. He became famous throughout Greece as a man especially favored by the gods. Other traditions credited him with extreme fasting, prophetic knowledge, and a mysterious food given to him by the nymphs, which allowed him to survive while hardly eating at all. He too claimed to have lived many past lives, having famously said he was the reincarnation of Aeacus, a mythical king and judge of the dead in the underworld. Diogenes also recounts the time when Epimenides purified Athens from a raging pestilence with the use of his prophetic expertise. The Pythian priestess urged the Athenians to get Epimenides' help. He purified the city by releasing sheep into the region and letting them wander wherever they pleased, instructing attendants to follow them. Wherever a sheep lay down to rest, the spot was marked, the sheep was sacrificed to the local divinity, and an altar was erected. And in this way, the plague ceased. The idea of interpreting the movement and behavior of animals as meaningful, whether as divine omens or signs, is widespread in shamanic and animistic worldviews, though it isn't an exclusively shamanic motif. There are many Greek myths that describe temples and cities being erected at the site where an animal died or stopped to rest. But Epimenides functioning as a kind of specialist that uses these signs to heal a wider community, however, is certainly a shamanic motif. Epimenides was said to have lived a very long time, with various ancient sources saying that he died at an age exceeding 150 years. A much later tradition preserved in the Byzantine Suda claimed that Epimenides could send his soul out of his body whenever he wished and then return again. The same source adds an even stranger detail. Long after his death, his skin was supposedly discovered tattooed with mysterious letters, an astonishing claim in a culture where tattooing was generally associated with slaves and foreigners. For scholars like Muley and Dodds, however, the report takes on a different significance. Across many Eurasian traditions, tattooing and ritual body markings formed part of shamanic initiation. On its own, the fact about tattoos is hardly conclusive, but this comparison does add another element in favor of Epimenides being a kind of shamanic figure. By the 5th century BC, however, these powers were no longer attributed only to shadowy travelers and semi-legendary miracle workers. They appear in the surviving words of one of Greece's most important philosophers, Empedocles of Acragas. In one surviving fragment, Empedocles promises to teach his companion Pausanias the remedies for sickness and old age, the power to still and summon the winds, to to bring rain during drought, and even to call back from Hades the life force of a dead man. These are not merely powers attributed to him by later admirers. They appear in poetry associated with Empedocles himself. Around a century after his death, miraculous stories were going around about how he could stay the winds with his magic, how he restored life to a woman who could no longer breathe, and how he vanished from the physical world by plunging into a volcano, so it is said, to become a god. Empedocles is among the best preserved of the pre-Socratic philosophers. He is most famously known for explaining the cosmos through the theory of the four classical elements and the opposing forces of love and strife. His surviving works refuse any clean separation between natural philosophy, religion, and magic. It combines cosmological speculation with purification, reincarnation, prophetic knowledge, miraculous power, and the possibility that the human soul might ultimately regain a divine condition. In essence, Empedocles is one of those figures that stands right on the threshold between what we would call magician and scientist. His theories about nature were written in poetic verse, where scientific claims were interwoven with religious, ethical, and ritualistic concerns. Scholar Erwin Rohde, in his 1925 book titled Psyche, the Cult of Souls and Belief in Immortality Among the Greeks, introduced me to another potential Greek shaman which I think is worth including. In the tradition which comes down to us in the surviving fragments from Heraclides Ponticus once again, a legendary sage named Empedotimus of Syracuse is remembered for his revelatory vision of the afterlife. Legend says that while he was out hunting at high noon alone in the woods, he experienced a divine epiphany of Pluto and Persephone. In the sky, he witnessed 3 gates and 3 ways, to the kingdoms and dwelling places of souls, the gods, and the dead. He also saw the Milky Way as a great path of souls arriving or departing the earth. Perhaps you've picked up on the shamanic element in the story, the 3 levels of reality, earth, sky, and underworld, which the shaman could move between in states of ecstasy. Now, this last figure, curiously named Empedotimus, is most likely an ancient fiction. He is likely a fusion of Empedocles and Hermotimus, contrived by Heraclides to add some additional lore to the Pythagoreans. Scholars like Rohde believe that the legend probably serves as a Pythagorean parallel to Plato's vision of Regardless, it still endures as another quasi-shamanistic legend associated with these pre-Socratic magicians. All of these figures taken together, I believe, seem to reveal an ecstatic current running along the fringes of early Greek thought, something that the more popular history of ancient Greek philosophy has largely ignored. Or worse, the pre-Socratics are seen as a bunch of simple-minded, primitive thinkers stammering around in their vain attempts to understand reality, just never quite getting it. I believe that interpretation is deeply wrong. What connects these figures is the recurring experience of ecstasy. And by ecstasy, we don't mean the modern drug or simply an overwhelming feeling of bliss. We're talking about a mystical experience. The word derives from the Greek ekstasis, displacement, departure from one's ordinary condition, or quite literally, standing outside oneself. Closely related was enthusiasmos, the condition of being filled with, inspired by, or possessed by a god, the root of our modern word, enthusiasm. Across the legends surrounding these figures, the same constellation of motifs repeatedly appears. Prolonged fasting, purification, prophecy, miraculous healing, divine possession, magical flight, and the ability of the soul to leave the body and return again. Are these similarities merely coincidental? Or do they preserve traces of a far more ancient current of religious ecstasy? entering the Greek world through contact with the Scythians and other peoples of the north? The beginnings of Greek philosophy didn't emerge through the victory of rationality over magic. The categories we now separate into religion, philosophy, medicine, poetry, and science remained deeply interconnected. Empedocles could explain the physical construction of the cosmos, while also claiming knowledge of reincarnation, purification, weather magic, and the restoration of life. Epimenides could be remembered simultaneously as a poet, prophet, healer, purifier, and wonder worker. Aristeas, Abaris, Hermotimus, Epimenides, and Empedocles are genuinely strange outliers in the history of ancient Greek thought, which, might we be reminded, is also the history of Western thought. In light of all this, it would seem that the roots of our modern world have grown out of some very murky and arcane waters, which even today remain poorly understood. But rest assured, it gets so much stranger, because these ecstatic currents didn't end with Empedocles. Further downstream, they begin to coalesce into more recognizable and sophisticated religious cults and schools. Among the followers of Pythagoras, in the mysterious traditions attributed to Orpheus, and in the mysteries of Dionysus, Bacchus, and Eleusis. We could also connect this to later Greek philosophers like Parmenides, Plotinus, and Plato. There's also the question about ancient psychedelics and the role that played in this story. And even the figure of Christ and the early Christian sect known as Gnosticism is linked to these earlier developments. I suspect that it's a thread we could trace right up to the present day. I plan on continuing this thread in the next video. But before we go, I want to hear what you think. Let me know your thoughts below. I genuinely look forward to reading them, as I'm sure there's a lot of you out there that are much more knowledgeable than I am on these subjects. Until next time, stay curious. Peace.
Just kidding, we're not actually done here yet. So, I wasn't a huge fan of that conclusion, mainly because I actually haven't reached a conclusion on this stuff for myself yet. And that's because there is just so much that I did not get to include in this video. So as I was doing the edit for this video, I was watching some of Peter Kingsley's interviews and started to realize that that guy's work is actually far more central to this story than I had thought before. And I bought a few of Peter Kingsley's books actually, and Amazon sent me 3 copies of one of them, so I kind of see that as a bit of a synchronicity. And then I had mentioned, I think, 5 or 6 of those Greek figures, and there's actually another one named Zalmoxis, who is probably pretty important, but just didn't get around to doing a deep dive on him too much. Pythagoras and Orpheus are, of course, 2 monumental torchbearers for this whole Greek shamanic tradition. And yeah, they kind of sit at this midpoint, transitionary point between the mythical and the philosophical, and they definitely deserve their own more extensive treatment. So suffice it to say, I'll be swimming in these waters for quite some time. And then you of course have the mystery schools, which are kind of the formalization of a lot of this stuff. So, and what I think those kind of represent are where these shamanic techniques were becoming accessible to ordinary people. They weren't just the domain of the shaman. They were formalized in schools and cults. So yeah, and then with the Orphic mysteries, I believe it was Jung who said that Orphism is kind of like a precursor to Gnosticism. You have a lot of the Gnostic beliefs of like the body being a prison and the world being a trap. Like, this is literally the first video I ever made was talking about this stuff. Yeah, and with the myth of Orpheus and the Orphic schools, that's kind of the time where you first see the idea of like the body being a trap and like the soul being detachable from the body. I believe that's where it first comes in. And, you know, getting into all this stuff, it goes way beyond the scope of what I wanted to talk about in this video, but it kind of directly follows from this stuff. And then, of course, yeah, Gnosticism is like early Christianity, and it was Christianity becoming a state religion that outlawed literally all of the mystery schools. And, yeah, I just find that so interesting. So yeah, there's so many rich areas to explore. But yeah, I'm hoping this stirs some good conversation in the comments. Hopefully the algorithm deems this a worthy sacrifice, a worthy offering. But yeah, that'll be it for this one. And yes, this is the official Mystical Polymath face reveal, so nice to meet you. And yeah, we'll see you in the next one.